18%. I mean, that's the number that woke up pretty much every CEO in Mumbai this morning. It's the number that has textile mill owners in Tarapur calling their bankers for expansion loans. And, well, it's the number that effectively redraws the map of global manufacturing. Welcome to the debate.
And while you're looking at that 18% figure, I'm looking at the invoice that came attached to it. $500 billion. That's the amount India has apparently committed to purchase an American goods, plus a hard stop on Russian oil. So you call this a map redraw? I think I'd call it a ransom note. We've essentially traded our strategic autonomy and maybe even our food security for a lower tax bracket.
And that right there is the central tension we need to unpack. Is this deal the trade strategist's dream that finally positions India as the factory of the world? Or is it a capitulation that imports inflation and could bankrupt our farmers? I'm arguing this is the decisive breakout moment India has been waiting for. We've outmaneuvered China and secured our economic future.
And I'm arguing that we've walked right into a trap. We're looking at a deal that, prioritizes the stock market over the supermarket and, frankly, American farmers over our own.
Okay, let's start with the reality on the ground, because I think you're underestimating just how desperate the situation was before yesterday. For the last 12 months, the Indian export engine has been sputtering. I was speaking with a textile exporter in Tirupur just last week. He was shutting down lines. And why? Because between the reciprocal tariffs and the punitive duties the U.S. slapped on us for buying Russian oil, his effective tariff rate to get a shirt into New York was climbing toward 50%. You just can't run a business with a 50% tax. You can't. Margins in textiles they're razor thin. We're talking pennies.
Look, I don't deny the export pain. I really don't. But you have to look at the...
But hold on. You have to understand the scale of the relief here. Yesterday, that 50% wall it crumpled down to 18%. But the genius of this deal isn't just that the number is lower. It's about bracketing. Look at our competition. Vietnam and Bangladesh, they're stuck at around 20%. And China is facing anywhere from 34 to 37%. And that's on a good day. For the first time, really, it is cheaper for a U.S. company to source from India than from Vietnam or China. That is a structural advantage that doesn't just save jobs, it steals them from our rivals. That's why the Nifty soared. That is why the rupee jumped 1.2%, the biggest single-day rally in 3 years. The market sees that the shackles are off.
The market sees a sugar rush. You're celebrating a headline and, completely ignoring the balance sheet. You mentioned the scale of the relief, so let's talk about the scale of the cost. President Trump was extremely specific in his post on Truth Social. He didn't just gift us 18%. He said India has committed to buy American to the tune of $500 billion. Do you realize how much money that is?
It's a target, a framework for the next decade.
It's not a suggestion. It's a quid pro quo. Let's just do the math for the listeners. Currently, India imports less than $50 billion a year from the U.S. So to hit $500 billion, we have to increase our imports by 10 times. That figure, $500 billion, is roughly equivalent to the entire expenditure of the union budget. We're talking about committing an amount of money that could run the entire country just to buy American goods. Where is the forex coming from that? We're going to drain our reserves to buy things we might not even need just to satisfy a quota. That isn't trade. That's tribute.
It's not tribute if you're buying things you need to modernize. You're framing this as if we're just writing a check for nothing. We aren't just sending cash to Washington. That $500 billion represents energy, defense systems, and high-tech capital goods. But I do want to address your anxiety about the cost, because you're glossing over the alternative. If we didn't do this, we were facing a trade war that would have wiped out millions of jobs in our labor-intensive sectors.
So we save the textile jobs by what? Sacrificing the farmers? Because that is the other shoe that dropped. Trump explicitly said India agreed to move tariffs to zero. And the U.S. Agriculture Secretary, Brooke Rollins, she immediately followed up by saying this will wipe out the $1.3 billion agricultural trade deficit. You don't wipe out a deficit that size by selling a few almonds. You do it by kicking down the door of the Indian dairy and poultry sectors.
You're jumping in the absolute worst-case scenarios. Zero tariff it's an aspirational direction, not a law that goes into effect tomorrow morning for every single product.
Tell that to the Americans. They view it as a binding contract. And this brings us to the most dangerous part of this deal, the non-veg milk issue. This is something the business papers are, a little too polite to discuss, but we have to.
I suspected you would bring up the blood meal issue.
It has to be discussed. For the listeners who might not know, in the United States, it's standard practice to feed dairy cattle what's known as blood meal, essentially dried animal blood and slaughterhouse byproducts to boost protein intake and milk yield cheaply. In India, that is a massive religious and cultural taboo. We've kept U.S. dairy out for decades by demanding certification that the milk comes from vegetarian-fed cows. The U.S. calls this a non-tariff barrier. If this deal removes zero non-tariff barriers, which is the language being used, we are literally forcing Indian consumers to drink milk produced in a way that violates their fundamental beliefs.
You are conflating market access with deregulation. There is absolutely no indication that our sanitary and phytosanitary norms, the SPS standards, have been abandoned. The government knows that dairy is a political third rail. What's more likely happening is that we're opening the door for specific, non-sensitive dairy derivatives, like whey protein isolates, which we already import in huge quantities, or industrial casein. We're not going to see cartons of blood meal milk on the shelves in Delhi.
That is incredibly naive. Once you lower the tariff to zero and agree to remove barriers, the U.S. lobby, which is far more powerful than our FSSI, will push for scientific equivalence. They'll argue that the milk is chemically identical, regardless of what the cow ate. And beyond the cultural issue, just look at the economics. The SBI analysis came out this morning. They estimate a loss of 1.03 lakh crore rupees annually if the dairy sector opens up. And it's not just dairy, it's poultry. Do you know why U.S. chicken is so cheap?
Economies of scale, I assume.
No, it's consumer preference. Americans love chicken breasts. They pay a premium for white meat. The legs, the dark meat, are essentially a waste product for them. So they freeze them and dump them on global markets at rock-bottom prices. India has protected its poultry farmers with 100% tariffs to stop this dumping. If that tariff goes to 18% or zero, our domestic poultry industry, which supports millions of small farmers, is obliterated. You can't compete with a product that is priced as garbage in its home market.
I understand the fear regarding the primary sector. I really do. But you are looking at this through a defensive lens. You're trying to protect the economy of 1990. I'm looking at the economy of 2030. Yes, there will be pressure on agriculture, and the government will have to manage that with subsidies or internal quotas. But the trade-off here is dominance in electronics. We are trading low-value agri-protectionism for high-value tech integration.
That sounds like a very fancy way of saying we're throwing farmers under the bus.
It's a way of saying we're prioritizing the future. Look at the reaction from the India Electronics and Semiconductor Association. They're calling this a catalyst. And why? Because the 18% tariff reduction works both ways, and the Buy American commitment unlocks the ICET framework, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology. We aren't just selling shirts. We're integrating companies like Dixon Technologies into the U.S. semiconductor supply chain. If the price of becoming a semiconductor superpower is allowing U.S. apples and some frozen chicken legs into the market, well, that is a price a rising power pays.
A rising power doesn't starve its own energy security, which brings me to the other disaster in this deal, the Russian pivot.
The Russian correction, I think you mean.
Call it what you want. We've agreed to stop buying Russian oil. For 3 years, that Russian discount was the only thing standing between the Indian middle class and double-digit inflation. We saved an estimated $5 billion annually. Now, to please Washington, we are cutting that cord.
That cord was already fraying. Look at the data from Nomura this morning. The so-called Russian discount is narrowed to low single digits. The geopolitical risk premium was eating up the savings. We were dealing with shadow fleets, payment issues, currency swaps that were getting harder and harder to execute. It was a headache.
A headache is better than a migraine. And a migraine is what we're going to get when we start importing inflation. You can't just swap Russian orals for American WTI and expect the price at the pump to stay the same. It's simple physics and geography. Shipping oil from Novorossiysk to Jamnagar, is a relatively straight shot. Shipping oil from Galveston, Texas to India involves crossing the Atlantic and the Mediterranean or going all the way around the Cape. The freight costs alone will add 5 to 10% to the landed cost of crude.
But Trump explicitly offered Venezuela as the alternative.
That's even worse. Potentially Venezuela, he said. Have you looked at the state of Venezuelan oil infrastructure? It's been rotting under sanctions for a decade. Their output is unreliable, and the crude is heavy and sour. It's harder to refine. We're pivoting from a reliable, massive producer like Russia to a broken state like Venezuela just because Trump tweeted it? That's reckless.
It's not reckless, it's strategic diversification. By shifting to U.S. and Venezuelan sources, we're moving our energy security back into the dollar-denominated grid. We stabilize the rupee by aligning our energy payments with our export earnings. That's why the rupee rallied. The market loves stability. We're decoupling from a pariah state, Russia, and locking ourselves into the energy grid of our largest trading partner.
You call it locking in, I call it handcuffing. Senator Lindsey Graham let the cat out of the bag. He said India earned this tariff cut by changing its behavior on Russia. Think about the implications of that. We've allowed a foreign power to dictate our foreign policy. We're no longer strategically autonomous. We're a junior partner helping the U.S. achieve its goals in Ukraine. If oil prices spike next year, we can't call Putin. We've burned that bridge. We are completely at the mercy of U.S. shale producers.
We're at the mercy of global markets regardless. At least now we have a preferential trade deal to offset some of that volatility. And frankly, autonomy doesn't put food on the table. Growth does. This deal secures growth by ensuring our goods remain competitive.
Growth comes from investment, not just consumption. Which brings me right back to the $500 billion Buy American mandate. You called it modernization. I want to know exactly what we are buying. Because if we are forced to buy $500 billion worth of goods and we don't need $500 billion worth of oil or almonds, the only thing left is defense.
And civil aviation.
Okay, defense and aviation. This strikes at the very heart of Atmanirbhar Bharat. You know, the whole self-reliant India mission. We've spent the last decade trying to build an indigenous defense industry. We have the Tejas fighter jet program. We have private players building artillery. So what happens to those domestic industries if we're suddenly forced to buy billions of dollars of American hardware just to meet a quota? You can't nurture a local defense ecosystem if you're flooding the market with Lockheed Martin and Boeing hardware just to balance a trade ledger.
You're missing the nuance of the technology transfer. This is the difference between buying a fish and buying a fishing rod. The government isn't stupid. They aren't going to spend this money on off-the-shelf rifles. The $500 billion will be channeled into capital goods, the machines that make the machines.
That sounds great in a PowerPoint presentation, but in reality...
No. Just look at the GE jet engine deal. We aren't just buying engines. We are buying the technology to manufacture them here to power the Tejas. That counts toward the trade balance. Look at the semiconductor equipment. We are buying chips. We're buying the lithography machines from American allies or U.S. supply chains to put into factories in Gujarat. That is how you hit $500 billion without killing domestic industry. You use the money to upgrade your industrial base.
That is a very optimistic if. You're assuming the U.S. will just share its crown jewel technology. History suggests they'll sell us the black box, but not the blueprints. And even if we buy the machines, we are draining our foreign exchange reserves to do it. We're taking capital that could be used for domestic infrastructure and sending it straight to U.S. corporations. It's a massive transfer of wealth.
It's the transfer of capability. And look, we have to talk about the alternative again. You keep pointing out the costs, but you aren't acknowledging the China factor. The 18% tariff gives us a 16 to 19% price advantage over China. Do you know what that does to a supply chain manager? It forces them to move to India. We have effectively China-proofed our economy. We are the only large-scale manufacturing hub that is inside the U.S. trust circle. That premium is worth the $500 billion.
China-proofing is a fantasy if our raw materials are still coming from China. Our pharmaceutical industry, it depends on Chinese APIs. Our solar industry depends on Chinese wafers. If we pivot so hard to the U.S. that Beijing decides to retaliate, that 18% tariff won't matter because we won't have the raw materials to make the shirt or the pill in the first place. We're poking the dragon to feed the eagle.
The dragon was already breathing fire on the border. We had to choose a side. This deal acknowledges reality. We have chosen the side that buys our services and our goods.
We've chosen the side that demands tribute. We have avoided a trade war, yes, I'll grant you that. The immediate collapse of the textile sector has been averted, but the price tag is exorbitant. We've signed up for structurally higher energy prices. We've placed an existential sword of Damocles over 80 million dairy and poultry farmers. And we have committed to a purchase order so large it threatens our macroeconomic stability. We may have gotten an 18% coupon, but we mortgaged the house to get it.
I see those risks differently. I see them as the growing pains of a superpower. You don't get a seat at the head table for free. The $500 billion is the entry fee. The non-veg milk issue will be managed with labeling and segmentation. We're smart enough to handle that. But the structural shift is permanent. We have bracketed ourselves with the West. We have replaced China. The 18% tariff is the weapon we needed to win the manufacturing war. The markets know it, the textile barons know it, and in 10 years we'll look back at this as the moment India truly arrived.
Or the moment we realized that Buy American was the most expensive phrase in the English language. Time will tell if the stock market euphoria can survive the grocery store inflation.
Indeed. And that is why we debate. Thank you for joining us on this breakdown of a historic, if not controversial deal.
Dig into the details, folks. The devil is always in the fine print.
Until next time.